There are two kinds of darkness in these mountains. The first kind is the darkness you know about, the kind that involves men with spotlights and rifles working the field edges after midnight, the kind that leaves a deer carcass at the side of a dirt road with the back straps cut out and the rest left to rot, the kind that has rules, unwritten but consistent, the rules of a human being doing something illegal who still wants to get the good meat and get home. That darkness, Ray Prewitt understood completely. He had spent 30 years documenting it, prosecuting it, driving the back roads of Scott County, Virginia at 2 in the morning, learning every variation of the ways men took from the National Forest what the National Forest was not offering. He knew that darkness the way a doctor knew disease. The second kind of darkness is what Ray found in his last year on the job. Kill sites with no weapon match in any database, wounds that no tool left, carcasses arranged in patterns that no poacher, not the most experienced, not the most methodical, not the strangest one Ray had ever arrested, would have made, because the patterns served no purpose a poacher would have. And a sound, coming from somewhere in the timber behind every kill site. A low sound, a resonant sound, something between a frequency and a call. The kind of sound that your ear received as sound, but that your body received as something older than hearing. The other wardens said they couldn't hear it. Ray thought they were lying. He also thought they were wise. He was not wise. He was a conservation officer in his last year before retirement, and he had built his career on following evidence to the end, and this was evidence. He followed it. This is the caller, Virginia blood and bone. Some sounds are not meant to be followed. Ray Prewitt started with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources in 1991, assigned to Scott County in the far southwest corner of the state, the heel of the boot, as locals called it, where Virginia ran out of room between Kentucky and Tennessee, and the mountains piled up against the border in long, steep ridges covered in national forest timber. It was not considered a choice assignment. Scott County was large, remote, understaffed, and the combination of economic hardship and deep cultural attachment to hunting that characterized the region meant the poaching caseload was heavy and the community relations were complicated. The job required a particular kind of officer, someone who understood that the man he was citing today was someone he was going to see at the hardware store on Saturday, whose daughter played with his daughter in the same youth soccer league, whose grandfather had hunted this mountain before the National Forest existed, and whose relationship with the concept of wildlife law was genuinely and historically complex. Ray was from the county. He understood the complexity. He enforced the law anyway, fairly and consistently, and over 30 years he had built a reputation as a warden who was hard but straight, a man who would arrest his own cousin if his own cousin was spotlighting, which he had, in fact, done in 2003, and which had made Thanksgiving difficult for a couple of years, but had not, in the long run, damaged the relationship. He knew every road and trail and creek crossing in his patrol area. He knew the poaching methods by heart, the spotlight rigs, the bait stations, the drives, the over-the-limit turkey takes, the illegal antler restrictions. He knew which families worked which parts of the forest and which parts of the year were highest risk. He knew the county the way you knew something you had given 30 years of close attention, which was why the kills in his last year disturbed him the way they did. They did not fit anything he knew. The first one was in October, 6 weeks before deer season opened. A doe, mature, found by a hiker on a fire road about 2 miles into the National Forest in the eastern part of the county. Ray had gotten the call and driven out and stood over the carcass and done the thing he had done hundreds of times. Assessed it systematically, working from the outside in, building a picture of what had happened. The carcass was wrong from the first look. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously wrong in the way that a spotlighting kill was wrong. The truck tracks on the road shoulder, the single entrance wound behind the shoulder, the back straps removed, the rest left. This was wrong in a subtler way, a way that took him several minutes of examination to articulate even to himself. The deer had not been taken by a firearm, no entrance or exit wound, no fragmentary evidence in the tissue, nothing that the ballistics consultant he called the following week could identify as projectile trauma. Not an arrow, no penetration pattern consistent with broadhead entry, no pass-through, no partial penetration. Not a snare, no ligature marking on the neck or leg joints, no indication of strangulation or restraint. Not a vehicle strike, no blunt force impact pattern, no road rash, nothing consistent with a deer hit at speed. The deer appeared to have been killed by something that had applied uniform, total pressure across the thoracic cavity, as if the chest had been compressed from both sides simultaneously with enormous force by something with no distinct shape. Ray had no framework for that. He wrote it up as an unusual natural death, internal hemorrhage, cause undetermined, and submitted the report and tried to move on. The second kill was 3 weeks later, and he could not write that one off. A buck this time, large, mature, in a drainage bottom 3 miles from the first site. Same cause of death, the thoracic compression, the absence of any identifiable weapon mark. But this one had been moved after death. That was the detail that changed everything. The deer had died somewhere upslope. The blood pattern at the compression site was 50 yards above where the carcass lay, and the drag trail between them was unlike any drag trail Ray had ever documented. Not the gouged, continuous trail of a deer dragged by a person with boot prints alongside and the belly hair scraped on roots and rocks. This trail was a series of spaced impressions, deep, ovoid, roughly 18 inches across, that ran from the blood site to the carcass in a straight line. The impressions went into the soil 4 to 6 inches. They were not tracks in any shape Ray recognized. And the carcass, when he reached it, was placed. That was the only word for it. Not dropped, not dragged to a stop. Placed, oriented north-south, legs folded, head positioned with the muzzle pointing upstream along the drainage. The exact configuration Ray had seen once before, years ago, in a photograph from a wildlife biology paper about wolf predation behavior in the northern Rockies. Wolves placed their kills oriented to terrain features, specifically to water flow, as a territorial behavior, a marking of the kill. There were no wolves in Scott County, Virginia. There were no animals in Virginia whose track measured 18 inches across. Ray stood in the drainage bottom in the October cold and looked at the placed deer and looked at the impressions in the soil and listened to the forest around him. That was when he heard the sound for the first time. He described it to me as something you felt before you heard it, a pressure in the inner ear, a vibration in the chest cavity, the specific physical sensation of being in proximity to something generating significant low-frequency sound before the sound itself became audible, like standing near large machinery, like standing near something enormous that was breathing. Then the sound itself, low, sustained, resonant, not a single note but a chord, multiple frequencies simultaneously, the way a large hollow space resonated when something moved inside it. Not an animal call in any form Ray recognized, not wind through timber, not water, a deliberate generated sound coming from somewhere in the timber above the drainage, maybe 200 yards up the slope. He stood and listened for perhaps 30 seconds. Then his radio crackled, his supervisor checking in, and he answered it, and when the radio conversation ended, he looked up the slope, and the sound was gone, and the forest was ordinary. And he drove back to the office and wrote up the second kill and said nothing about what he'd heard. He told his supervisor, probable wolf predation, origin unknown, monitoring the area.
His supervisor had said, "There are no wolves in Scott County." Ray had said, "I know."
By the end of November, he had documented 7 kill sites. He had not shared the full documentation with anyone. This was not standard procedure. Unusual kill patterns were supposed to be flagged immediately, reported up the chain, potentially referred to state wildlife biologists or federal wildlife officials if the cause was unidentifiable. Ray had done none of this. He had filed brief, vague incident reports describing the kills as cause undetermined and continued his investigation alone, which he would later admit was a decision driven partly by professional caution and partly by something less rational. A reluctance to share what he was finding, a sense that the thing he was tracking was his to track, that it had presented itself to him specifically and he owed it his full and sole attention. He recognized that impulse as wrong even at the time. He followed it anyway. The 7 kill sites formed a pattern that only became visible when he plotted them on a topographic map. Each site was in a different drainage, in different terrain, at different elevations. No clustering that would suggest a territorial predator working a fixed home range. But when he drew lines connecting consecutive kill sites in chronological order, the line moved. Slowly, consistently northward. Each site was further north than the previous one, by a distance that translated to roughly 2 miles of northward movement over 6 weeks. Something was moving through the national forest from south to north, moving slowly, taking kills as it went, each kill placed and oriented the same way. He pulled the historical records. It took him 3 days, working through paper files that went back to the 1960s and digitized records going back further, cross-referencing unusual kill reports across multiple decades of Scott County wildlife data. He found it in the records from 1987. 11 unusual kills across 6 weeks, moving north through the national forest from the Tennessee border. Cause of death listed as undetermined in every file. No follow-up investigation documented. The officer who had filed the reports had retired within the year. And in 1964, 9 kills. The same, moving north. Same cause of death notations. The officer who filed those reports had transferred to a desk job in Richmond within 6 months and had never returned to field work. And in 1941, 7 kills. The same. Every 23 years, give or take. Moving north through the national forest, taking kills as it went, and then, in all 3 previous records, simply stopping. The last documented kill in each sequence was at the northern edge of the national forest boundary, at the ridge crest above the county seat. The ridge crest above the county seat, where Ray was standing when he found the 7th kill site. He looked at the topo map for a long time. The 7th kill site was the last. He understood that looking at the map without knowing how he understood it. The thing was done moving. It had arrived where it was going. And the sound, which he had heard at 4 of the 7 sites, always from above and behind the kill, always moving away, was now constant. Not coming from above the 7th site, coming from the ridgeline itself, from the north-facing slope below the crest, from the dense, old-growth timber that no logging road had ever reached and no hunting party had ever worked because the terrain was too steep and the timber access too poor. Constant, present, waiting. Ray put down his map. He had 3 weeks left before his retirement date. He told his wife he would be working late. He told the office he was running a stakeout on a suspected spotlighting operation in the eastern county. He drove to the trailhead at the base of the north-facing slope. He went in. The north-facing slope was everything the topo map had suggested. Brutally steep, the trail a matter of interpretation rather than a cleared and marked path. The old-growth timber so dense that his headlamp barely reached the next tree before the light diffused into the canopy. He had a rifle, his service weapon, a .308, and his radio and his GPS unit and 30 years of experience in this county, and none of those things made the climb feel manageable in any normal sense. What made it manageable was the sound. It was clearer here than it had ever been at any of the kill sites. Louder, but not in a way that was proportional to proximity. It was not simply that he was closer to its source. It was that it had a directionality now, a specificity that let him navigate by it the way you navigated by a sound in fog. It was coming from above him and slightly left of his current bearing, and it was pulling him the way a sound pulled you when your body recognized it before your mind did. He climbed for 40 minutes. He was in good physical condition for 61 years old, but 40 minutes of steep north-facing slope in the dark left him breathing hard and soaked through his base layer with sweat, and he stopped on a flat shelf of exposed limestone that jutted from the hillside like a porch, and he stood and caught his breath and listened. The sound was above him, very close, 50 yards, maybe less, in the dense timber above the limestone shelf. He turned off his headlamp. He stood in the dark for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting his breathing slow. Then he climbed the last 50 yards without the light. He found the clearing at the top of the slope by stepping into it. One moment the dense timber pressing on him from every side, and then the canopy opened and the overcast December sky was visible above, and he was standing in a roughly circular opening in the old growth, perhaps 60 feet across, the ground bare of undergrowth, the soil dark and compacted. The sound was here, not from the timber around the clearing, from the clearing itself, from somewhere below the surface of the compacted earth, as if something very large was present beneath the clearing, and the sound was the sound of it, the way the sound of a vast engine was the sound of the engine's operation. Ray stood at the edge of the clearing, and he put his hand on his rifle, and he looked at the center of it. There was something in the center of the clearing. It was not an animal. It was not a person. It had no shape that Ray's eye could hold for more than a fraction of a second, not because it was moving, but because it occupied space in a way that resisted the mechanism by which his visual system assembled information into coherent objects. Every time his eye found an edge, a surface, a feature, the feature dissolved and reassembled elsewhere, so that the act of looking at it was a constant process of almost resolving and then losing resolution again. He understood, with the specific clarity of a man whose professional life had been built on accurate observation, that he was looking at something his visual system had no category for. He stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. The sound continued, not louder, not directed at him, simply present the way it had been present for the entire climb, a baseline, a constant, the sound of whatever this was simply being what it was. Ray raised his rifle. Not to fire. He understood immediately that firing was not a meaningful action in the context of whatever he was looking at, but the act of raising the rifle was his body's trained response to confronting something unknown, and his body was 30 years ahead of his mind in that moment. The thing in the clearing did not respond to the raised rifle. It did not respond to him in any way he could identify. He was not sure it was aware of him. He was not sure awareness was a category that applied to it. He lowered the rifle. He stood in the cold dark at the edge of the clearing, and he watched the thing in the center that his eye could not hold, and he thought, with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 30 years building cases from evidence, about what he was actually observing. What he was actually observing was the source of 7 unexplained kills across 6 weeks, arrayed in a southward pattern that implied a northward migration, recurring every 23 years in Scott County records going back 80 years, on a north-facing ridge slope that appeared on no hunting map because no one had ever worked it. What he was actually observing was something that had been coming here for at least 80 years of documented history, and almost certainly much longer than that. What he was actually observing was something that had a pattern and a territory and a behavior, that killed in a specific way and moved in a specific direction and rested in a specific place,
the way any predator had a pattern and a territory and a behavior. And the thing that he kept returning to, standing in the cold dark with the sound moving through his chest and his rifle in his hands, was this. He had not been summoned here by the evidence. He had been summoned here by the sound that his colleagues said they could not hear, the sound that had been present at 4 of the 7 kill sites and that had been moving north ahead of him, the way a guide moved ahead of the person they were leading, until it stopped here at this clearing and waited. It had been calling him for 6 weeks, and he had followed it, exactly as it intended.
He stood in the clearing for an hour and 15 minutes. He knew the time because he had checked his watch when he stepped into the clearing, and he checked it again when the thing in the center began to change. Changed was not quite the right word. It was more that the quality of its resistance to his visual system altered. The constant dissolving and reassembling of its apparent form slowed, and then slowed further, until it was holding a shape for 2 or 3 seconds at a time before losing it again. What the shape resolved into in those 2 and 3 second windows was not something Ray had words for. He has described it to me as a series of impressions rather than a coherent image. Mass, density, the suggestion of scale that was much larger than the clearing should have been able to contain, the way a shape in fog implied a size that the visible portion did not confirm. And within those brief moments of resolution, something that was almost anatomy. Not human anatomy and not animal anatomy in any sense he recognized, but an organization of mass and form that implied internal structure, that implied the presence of systems that did things. He watched it resolve and dissolve for 45 minutes, and then it showed him something. He has never described to me exactly what he showed him. He has tried 3 times and stopped each time, not because he was unwilling, but because the language failed at a specific point. The point where whatever he saw crossed from something he could translate into words and became something that existed in a register that words did not reach. What he has told me is the effect of it, which is not the same as the content, but is the part that has stayed with him. He said, "It showed me the kills. Not as I had documented them, not from my perspective, crouching over a carcass with a flashlight and a camera, from its perspective, from above and from all sides simultaneously, the way you might understand the total context of something if you were not limited to a single viewpoint. And in that perspective, the kills were not what I had documented them as. They were not predation. They were not hunting in any sense I understood." He paused. They were more like what we would call marking, or greeting, the way an animal marked territory with scent, not to take something, but to say, "I am here, I have been here, I will be here again." He said, 23 years, that's the cycle. It makes that journey, and it makes those marks, and it comes to this ridge, and it stays for a time, and it goes back. And it has been doing that for long enough that the cycle was old before the National Forest existed, before Scott County existed, before any of us had names for any of this. I asked him, "How long?" He shook his head. "The sense I got," he said, "was geological, not historical, not the kind of time that has records, the kind of time that made the ridge." He walked back down the slope in the dark. The sound was gone by the time he reached the limestone shelf, not fading, simply absent, the way a presence was absent when it had moved on. Whatever had been in the clearing had finished what it was doing and was no longer there, or no longer in a form or location that generated the sound. He reached his truck at the trailhead at 3:40 in the morning. He sat in the truck for a long time. Then he drove home. Ray Prewitt retired on schedule, 3 weeks after the night on the north-facing slope. His colleagues threw him the traditional retirement party. His supervisor made a speech. There was a cake. Someone had made a shadow box of his badge and his service patches, and a photograph of him from 1991 in his first-year uniform, impossibly young-looking, standing beside his first patrol truck. He received it all with the composed dignity of a man who had made his peace with something that no retirement party would ever be large enough to address. He had submitted, in his final 2 weeks, a comprehensive report on the 7 kill sites, full documentation, photographs, wound analysis, movement pattern mapping, the historical record comparison going back to 1941. He had characterized the cause as an unidentified large predator consistent with historical patterns in the county, recommended continued monitoring of the Northern Ridge area during the relevant cycle window, and flagged the case for follow-up by his replacement. He had not described the clearing. He had not described the sound. He had not described what he had seen in the clearing or what it had shown him. His replacement was a 28-year-old officer from Roanoke who had asked during their handoff meeting about the Northern Ridge case. Ray had looked at him for a moment. Then he had said, "Standard monitoring protocol. Nothing active up there right now. You've got 22 years before it becomes relevant again." The younger officer had nodded and written it down. Ray had looked at what he wrote down and had said, "Add a note. If you ever hear a sound you can't identify, low frequency, resonant, coming from the timber behind a kill site, don't follow it." "What kind of sound?" the officer asked. "You'll know it. It's the kind of sound that wants you to follow it. It's the kind of sound that makes you feel like it would be professionally irresponsible not to investigate." He paused. "It will be the most compelling investigative lead you've ever encountered, and you should not follow it." The younger officer looked at him. "Did you follow it?" he asked. Ray picked up his hat. He said, "I retired. Make what you will of that." He walked out of the office and got in his personal truck and drove home, and that was the end of 30 years of conservation work in Scott County, Virginia. I asked him, the last time we spoke, whether he regretted following the sound. He took a long time with the question. "No," he said. "I needed to know. I've spent 30 years knowing everything that happened in those mountains. The idea that there was something happening that I didn't know about and couldn't account for, that would have been harder to live with than what I saw." "And what you saw," I said, "is livable," he said. "It's not comfortable, and it's not something I could explain to anyone who wasn't standing in that clearing, and it changed the way I understand the forest and everything that happens in it. But it's livable." He looked out the window. "It was doing what it had always done. It wasn't interested in me. Not in any predatory sense. It had called me up there. I believe that. I believe it wanted me there, wanted a witness or a documentation or something, and then it showed me what it was, and then it left." "Why you? Why a conservation officer, not a hunter or a hiker?" He looked at me with the expression of a man who had thought about a question a great deal and arrived at an answer that was humbling in a specific way. "Because I was the one who kept the records," he said. "Because in my files and my colleagues' files and my predecessors' files, every 23 years for 80 years, someone had documented what it did and filed those documents, and no one had ever connected them. It had been witnessed and recorded and not understood, over and over for generations, and I think it troubled it." A pause. "I think it wanted someone to understand that the record existed, that it wasn't something unknown, that it had been here, documented, accounted for, every cycle by the people whose job it was to know what happened in those mountains." He said, "It wanted to be known, not feared, not hunted, known." He said it quietly, with the tone of a man who had made peace with something genuinely strange. "And now you know," I said. "Now I know." He picked up his coffee. "Next cycle is in 22 years. The young officer will be 50 by then. I hope he remembers what I told him." He paused. "I hope he doesn't follow the sound." He said it the way you said something you meant and also doubted, because the sound, when it called you, was very hard to resist. He, of all people, knew that.
Scott County, Virginia. The National Forest. The north-facing slope. The old-growth timber that nobody ever logged because nobody could get equipment in there. The clearing at the top. The records go back to 1941. 3 documented cycles in 80 years.
23 years between each one. 7 kills each time. Moving north. Same cause. Same placement. And a sound, low, resonant. The sound of something very large being exactly what it is, that the wardens who heard it were told they hadn't heard. Ray Prewitt is the only one who followed it. The only one who made it to the clearing, the only one who stood in the dark and watched it hold a shape for 2 or 3 seconds at a time and tried to understand what his eye was seeing. He says it wanted to be known. He says it wasn't interested in him in any harmful way. He says it showed him something and then it left. I believe him. I also believe that the sound did not call him because he was safe. It called him because he was the one keeping the records, because he was the one who would write it down. In 22 years, someone in Scott County will start finding kills. Wrong wounds. Wrong placement. Moving north. And somewhere in the timber behind those kill sites, a sound will begin. I hope the warden who hears it remembers what Ray said. I hope they have the discipline to not follow it. I don't think they will. The sound does not give you a choice you can easily refuse. That is the whole point of it. That is what it means to be called. If the caller stayed with you tonight, if you're still thinking about that sound, about what it means to be called towards something in the dark by your own professional instincts, your own need to know, leave me a comment below. Tell me, if you heard a sound in the woods that you couldn't identify and couldn't explain, and every part of your experience was telling you to follow it, would you? I want to know where your line is. I read every one. Virginia Blood and Bone continues with the next story in this series. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it. The forest is full. The records are old. And somewhere in Scott County right now, in the deep timber above the county seat, something is resting between cycles, waiting for 22 years to pass, waiting to move again. Stay on the marked trails. Trust your radio. And if you hear something you cannot explain coming from the timber, something low, something resonant, something that makes your chest vibrate before your ears register it, write it down, file the report, and do not follow it into the dark.